Holden Barrett paid $900 for a rusted block of iron-gathering dust behind an abandoned warehouse at the edge of Columbus, Ohio. People laughed when the single father hauled it home on the back of his worn pickup, and CEO Sierra Calloway stood before the crowd and said out loud, for everyone to hear, "That thing has been dead for 15 years. It will never run again." But on night 47, when Holden plugged the final cable into a cracked control panel in a cold one-man shop in the middle of nowhere, the entire darkness lit up blue. And on the fractured screen in front of him appeared a single line of text that would send Asterion Motors into a desperate, quiet panic. If you love stories about the underestimated rising to overturn an empire, stay with this one until the very end. The auction took place on a gray November morning at a decommissioned testing facility outside Columbus, the kind of place that smells like wet concrete and old oil, where chain-link fences rust quietly and the past accumulates behind loading dock doors nobody opens anymore. Asterion Motors had filed the liquidation paperwork 3 weeks earlier, citing the consolidation of legacy assets, which was the polished corporate way of saying they were throwing away the past before anyone could ask too many questions about it. The buyers who showed up were a thin, weathered crowd, scrap dealers with calloused hands, small shop mechanics looking for bargain parts, a few collectors who traded in antique machinery the way other people collected coins. Nobody important, nobody who remembered. Holden Barrett arrived late, parking his Ford F-250 at the far edge of the lot. He wore a denim jacket with a split seam at the left shoulder and work boots that had seen too many early mornings. He had not come for parts to resell. He had driven 40 minutes because a contact had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that the facility contained an unidentified test frame, listed in the liquidation manifest without a model number, without a description, with almost no information at all. That kind of deliberate blankness had interested him. He found it in the back corner of the largest warehouse, covered with a gray tarp, so heavy with dust it had stiffened into its own shape. When Holden pulled the edge back, what he saw stopped him mid-motion. The body panels had been stripped nearly to the bones. The control board was scorched along one side. The battery housings were empty, a human silhouette of a vehicle, reduced to structure and intention. But Holden recognized the dual-loop cooling brackets along the undercarriage, the secondary chamber housing along the spine, and the concave curve at the rear where the turbine assist module was meant to sit. He had seen those curves in a drawing once, years ago, late at night, in a break room that smelled like stale coffee. He had been 28 years old. The auctioneer introduced it without ceremony as industrial scrap, probable non-operational, bid to start at $500. A few people near the front laughed. One man said it would make a good planter if you cut the roof off. Holden stood still and raised his hand when the bidding stalled at $800. He went to $900. No one followed. The room gave a collective half-law, the sound people make when they have decided someone is entertaining. It was while Holden was signing the purchase form that Sierra Calloway walked in through the side entrance with 4 people at her back. 2 lawyers, a communications officer, and a man in a dark coat who didn't look like either. Sierra was the CEO of Asterion Motors, 39 years old, with the kind of composed face that gave nothing away and the kind of posture that gave everything away. She had come to supervise the liquidation personally, which told anyone paying attention that there was something here worth supervising. When her eyes found Holden at the desk, and then found the vehicle he had just purchased, something moved across her expression. A flicker, fast and involuntary, before it went flat again. She approached and asked, in a tone that was not quite a question, whether he understood what he had acquired. Holden said it was something that had never been finished correctly. Sierra let out a short, measured exhale and said, loudly enough for the people nearby, "That prototype didn't fail because we ran out of good engineers. It failed because it couldn't run. No one is going to bring it back to life. The room laughed. Holden finished signing, pocketed his copy, and went to get the tow cables. As he pulled out of the lot, he did not look back. But if he had, he would have seen Sierra still standing in the warehouse entrance, watching the truck disappear with an expression that had nothing to do with contempt. It looked like the face of someone who had just watched something they buried begin to move. Merrow Creek was not the kind of town that appeared on lists of anything. It sat at the intersection of two state highways in a fold of landscape that was mostly corn and sky. Barrett Mechanical Repair occupied a low building at the edge of town, set back from the road behind a gravel lot. A painted metal sign faded to a suggestion of itself. A garage bay that could fit two vehicles side by side if you parked carefully, and the deep biographical smell of engine oil that never fully leaves a space once it has moved in. This was where Holden brought the RX-1. He unloaded it on a Tuesday morning while a light rain came down, and when it settled onto the concrete floor of his shop, it looked like something from a different world. Travis Nolan, who owned the parts supply store 2 blocks down, stood in the doorway and told Holden to strip it and sell the metal. He said the scrap alone would cover a decent lunch. Holden thanked him and handed him a cup of coffee. Nolan left shaking his head. Maddie Barrett was 14 and came into the shop after school that day and stood looking at the RX-1 the way you look at something you cannot quite categorize. She asked why he had spent money they didn't have on something that broken. Holden told her that sometimes the fact that something gets left behind doesn't mean it has nothing left to say. Maddie considered this and went inside to start dinner. Holden had worked at Asterion Motors 15 years earlier, not as a lead engineer, not as anyone whose name appeared in press releases. He had been on a systems integration team, largely invisible to the people whose names appeared on patent applications. When the RX-1 project was shut down, the official account cited a critical testing error, and a name appeared in the internal review, not prominently, but clearly enough: Holden's name. He had, in fact, submitted a written safety flag 2 weeks before the incident. It had been acknowledged and ignored. None of that made it into the official record. His wife left 2 years later, not dramatically but in the slow way of someone who had decided that a life built on uncertainty was not what she had signed up for. He did not blame her. He raised Maddie, ran the shop, and stopped thinking about anything with the Asterion name on it, until the morning he heard RX-1 attached to a liquidation notice. On the first night alone in the shop with the machine, he pulled the tarp off and ran his hands along the stripped chassis. The Asterion logo on the side panel had oxidized to a ghost of itself. He said quietly, "To no one but the machine. They called you a failure, but I know they never let you finish your sentence." He reached for his notebook and began cataloging. The first real discovery came within an hour. The core structure was intact. Not bent, not warped. The damage was comprehensive but superficial. Someone had stripped it systematically, hollowed it out. But the bones were sound, and that was not what you expected from a machine that had supposedly destroyed itself in a catastrophic test. He worked until 2 in the morning. When he finally set down his tools, he was photographing the interior of the control housing when he noticed a small adhesive label on the inside of the port bay cover, yellowed but legible. It read RX-1, Unit 03, Final Trial Not Completed. He stayed very still for a moment. This was not the machine that had failed. This was the machine that had never been tested at all. The Asterion Motors headquarters occupied 12 floors of glass in Chicago's West Loop, the kind of building that declared its own importance through sheer transparency. On the day Holden Barrett was loading the RX-1 onto his flatbed in Merrow Creek, Sierra Calloway was in a conference room presenting a $2.4 billion product launch strategy to institutional investors who had watched the company fall behind its competitors for most of a decade. The presentation was precise and confident and delivered without hesitation. 2 hours after the auction concluded, a junior associate told her the buyer of the RX-1 was a former employee named Holden Barrett, who had been part of the original support team. Sierra asked whether the liquidation agreement prohibited restoration. Her legal director said that because the unit had been sold as scrap, physical ownership had transferred cleanly. Software architecture, patents, and documented test data remained Asterian's property. The machine itself was his. Sierra said she wanted him monitored quietly. At the board meeting 2 days later, Von Mercer expressed irritation. He told Sierra she had been careless in allowing the unit to reach public auction. Sierra told him the unit was non-operational. It was missing its activation core and the cold start sequence that only one person had ever held in complete form. Mercer looked at her and said something that fell strangely in the room. "It doesn't matter whether it runs. What matters is that it not be seen." That sentence carried a weight that had nothing to do with mechanics. A phone video from the auction, grainy, showing Holden hooking the tow cable to the RX-1 as a crowd watched, had begun circulating on regional technology forums. The reactions were predictably unkind. A single father from a small town had bought a dead prototype for less than $1,000. The CEO of the company had already said it was impossible. Whitney Boone, an independent technology journalist in Cincinnati, saw the clip on a Thursday evening and recognized the RX-1 designation. She had tried twice to research it and both times found the same thing. A name, a few product announcements from the early 2000s, and then nothing. Clean, smooth absence where information should have been. She drove to Marrow Creek. Holden turned her away twice. He did not want cameras, and he did not want narrative. He was trying to understand a machine, not become a story. But Whitney came back a third time with something new. She had found a name. Gideon Hart, a senior engineer from the original development team, had sent an email in 2011 to an automotive trade publication stating that the project's termination had not followed standard review protocol and that the test data had never been made public. When Whitney said the name Gideon Hart, Holden went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. That night, Sierra received an image from the person she had assigned to watch the shop. Holden had opened the central housing bay of the RX-1. She sent 2 words to Von Mercer. He replied with an instruction she relayed without hesitation: "Get it back, before he finds the second core." Gideon Hart lived in a 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Dayton that looked, from the outside, like a man had moved in and immediately stopped caring about the outside. Inside was a different situation, labeled archive boxes, drafting tables with yellowed graph paper still pinned down, a wall of technical manuals organized by era, and the quiet, complex smell of a space that had been used for serious thinking for a long time. Gideon was 71 and spoke with the precision of a man who had spent decades ensuring every word and every measurement was exactly correct. He came to the door and looked at Holden without recognition. When Holden said Unit 03, something reorganized behind Gideon's eyes. He opened the door wider. He made coffee. He sat down and asked, before anything else, whether Holden truly understood what he was reaching for. He said, "It's not just the machine that wakes up. The people who buried it wake up too." Holden said he was prepared for that. Gideon set down his mug and talked. The Asterion RX-1 had never been only an electric vehicle. The project was built around a micro-turbine regenerative hybrid drive system, a miniaturized gas turbine that did not directly power the vehicle but continuously recharged a compressed energy buffer, creating a recovery cycle that extended range far beyond what contemporary battery technology allowed. Early simulations suggested efficiency ratios the industry would not reach for more than a decade. The problem was timing and money. Asterion's board had committed, in 2006, to a major partnership with a battery cell manufacturer worth hundreds of millions, predicated on large-format lithium packs as the future of electric propulsion. If the RX-1 system succeeded in public testing, it would call that entire investment into question and expose the board's strategic pivot as economics, rather than engineering conviction. 3 units had been built. Unit 01 experienced a thermal event during early testing and was destroyed. Unit 02 was disassembled for analysis. Unit 03, the machine in Holden's shop, had never completed a full trial. It had been ready. The testing date had been set. Then, 12 minutes before the sequence was scheduled to begin, a hold order came from the executive level and was never reversed. Holden asked why Calloway had claimed the machine couldn't run. Gideon answered plainly, "If it runs, then 15 years of decisions become 15 years of lies." Then Gideon reached under the drafting table and pulled out a cardboard mailing tube. Inside were several sheets of technical paper, the dual-loop cooling schematic and the secondary control core layout, drawn in the precise hand of someone who had memorized every line before committing it to paper. Critical information, but not complete. What was missing was the cold start activation sequence, a layered software command chain necessary to bring the turbine online without triggering the battery buffer's automatic fail-safe protocols. Without it, any attempt to start the turbine risked destroying the entire drive system. Only one person had ever held the complete version of that code: the project's former software lead, Dorian Blake, who had not worked in the automotive industry since 2010. At the door, Gideon gripped Holden's arm and said, "Don't restore it like a car. Restore it like testimony." Holden drove back to Marrow Creek, spread the drawings across the rear wall of his shop, and stood back to look at what remained. Frame reinforcement, auxiliary power, cooling loop rebuild, turbine priming circuit, control core, and a cold start code he didn't yet have. He picked up the notebook and started at the top of the list. The restoration was not a montage of inspiration and smooth progress. It was weeks of slow, hard, frequently discouraging work in a cold building with inadequate equipment and a budget that required constant improvisation. Holden sourced a recycled industrial cooling pump from a decommissioned food processing plant 40 miles away. He wound replacement coils from copper stripped out of a retired generator. He machined custom brackets on a CNC unit old enough to have a manual written in a font no longer used. He ran the shop during the day, oil changes, brake jobs, alignment work, and worked on the RX-1 from the time the last customer left until his hands stopped being reliable. Maddie learned to recognize which nights required silence. She would leave a plate of food on the corner of the workbench closest to the RX-1 without saying anything, and Holden would find it an hour later, still warm. Among the things he discovered as he worked deeper into the machine was something he had suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm too early. The primary wiring harness had been cut. Not frayed, not corroded, cut. At 3 separate junctions, in locations that would only be meaningful to someone who understood the system's internal logic. Someone had made the machine look like it had failed. It had been made to perform its own death. A regional television station ran a short piece around week 4. Single dad spends last savings on impossible prototype. A former Asterion operations manager explained on camera that if the company's full engineering division had not been able to make the RX-1 viable, no sole proprietor mechanic in rural Ohio was going to change that. Sierra Calloway was asked about the situation at a technology panel in Detroit and gave the camera a practiced smile before saying, "Engineering does not run on hope. The RX-1 will never move under its own power again." The quote became a headline and attached Holden's name to a very public prediction of failure. Whitney came back to the shop and asked again whether she could document any part of the process. Holden refused initially. He didn't want to turn RX-1 into entertainment. But after Asterion's public statement, Whitney said something that landed accurately. "If they get to frame you as delusional, you should at least have the right to show people what you're actually doing." He agreed to limited access, No technical details, no close footage of internal components. Around day 31, Holden's hand adjusted a relay sequence in the secondary control array and the panel lit up. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The old Asterion startup icon appearing on the cracked central screen in pale blue against black, then dark again. He sat back on his heels and allowed himself a slow exhale. 2 days later, a legal notice arrived by certified mail. Asterion Motors was formally requesting that he cease all restoration activities involving proprietary software architecture, effective immediately, under penalty of civil action. Holden read the letter 3 times. He set it on the corner of the workbench, in the same spot where Maddie left his dinner. Then he walked back to the RX-1 and picked up his tools. Asterion's next move was more direct. A woman named Mallory Quinn arrived at the shop one morning in a car too clean for the gravel lot and introduced herself as corporate legal counsel. She explained that activation of any embedded proprietary software constituted unauthorized use of Asterion intellectual property. She then offered him $25,000 for the unit, contingent on immediate transfer and a standard non-disclosure agreement. $25,000 was not a small number for a man 3 months behind on his equipment financing. Holden looked at the offer sheet. Then he asked why something claimed to be non-operational was worth $25,000 to the people who had discarded it for $900. Mallory said she was not authorized to discuss valuation methodology. Holden thanked her. She left. Within 10 days, the financial pressure became specific. The bank called about his equipment loan. A commercial repair contract he had been counting on for the winter was canceled without explanation. His primary parts supplier informed him they were moving to a prepayment-only policy for his account. Whitney traced the chain and found that a holding company with documented ties to a fund managed by Von Mercer had recently purchased a stake in the supplier's parent company. The pressure was being applied from outside, slowly and without fingerprints. Holden sat alone in the shop one night with the invoices stacked on the bench and the RX-1 3 feet away and unfinished. Maddie came in around 10. She set his old Asterion-era engineering notebook on the bench in front of him. She had found it in a box in his closet months ago and said nothing about it until now. She told him she didn't understand most of what was in it, but she knew that every time she'd seen him look at the RX-1, he didn't look like someone fixing a machine. He looked like someone trying to find a version of himself he had set down somewhere and couldn't locate. She said goodnight and went back to the house. Holden opened the notebook. He decided he wasn't selling. The break-in happened 3 nights later. The motion alarm Holden had wired himself, a simple, pressure-triggered system on the shop door, not sophisticated but loud, went off at 1:40 in the morning. By the time he reached the garage, whoever had been inside was gone. The door lock had been bypassed cleanly. A data port module on the inside of the control bay had been removed. A small piece, but one that interfaced with the diagnostic memory banks. Holden had photographed everything before reassembling each section. He had the schematics. He had not lost the thread. He reviewed the security camera footage, and in the single clear frame where the figure turned near the rear wall, he made out the chest logo on their jacket, a maintenance contractor whose name he recognized from old Asterion vendor documents. He understood then that this was no longer a restoration. This was a confrontation, and only one side had acknowledged it so far. Holden tried reaching Dorian Blake, former software team lead, writer of the cold start sequence, 7 times over 2 weeks. No answer. He left a single voicemail on the 7th attempt. "My name is Holden Barrett. I have Unit 03 in a shop in Ohio. It isn't dead, but I need the truth to wake it up." 3 days later, an unlisted number called back. Dorian was 61 and spoke in the careful, abbreviated way of someone who had spent a long time choosing words for their defensive properties. He told Holden to stop. He said the RX-1 had not been shut down because of a technical failure. He said the final simulation run, performed on Unit 03 before the scheduled physical trial, had returned efficiency metrics that exceeded every internal benchmark by a margin that made the company's existing technology roadmap look as if it had been designed backward. The decision to cancel the physical test had been made within hours of those simulation results reaching the executive level. Holden asked why Dorian had said nothing for 15 years. Dorian was quiet for a moment. He said he had signed a settlement agreement under the credible threat of a lawsuit that would have destroyed him financially. He had a family, a mortgage, and he had been afraid. Then he said something that carried real weight. But I didn't destroy the code. I couldn't. Everyone who worked on that system poured something real into it. I wasn't going to pretend it didn't exist because someone with a title decided it was inconvenient. He offered Holden a partial path. He would describe the logical structure of the cold start sequence verbally, but first he wanted to verify Holden understood the system well enough to use it without destroying the turbine on the first attempt. Holden walked him through the reverse cooling cycle, the valve timing for the turbine bring-up, and the method for masking the auxiliary battery's auto shut-off signal during the initial ignition window. When he finished, Dorian said, "Gideon was right. You're the only one who still listens to what this machine is saying." A physical storage drive arrived at Whitney's address several days later. On it was the complete activation sequence, annotated with edge conditions and failure states. Also on it was a data file Dorian had included with a single line of explanation. "You'll need to understand what else you're turning on." The file described a passive archiving protocol embedded in the RX-1's core system at Gideon's insistence during final assembly, labeled internally as the Black Orchard Protocol. If the unit's original activation core was used to bring the system online, the protocol would automatically compile and transmit the complete archived test log, including all simulation data, all executive communications flagged to the project file, and a record of every command issued to the unit's operational status during its final active period. This was why Sierra had said second core. The second core was not a spare part, it was a witness. Holden went back into the control bay and reached behind the thermal insulation layer on the left interior wall. He found the module exactly where Dorian's file said it would be, a palm-sized component sealed in metal, wrapped in foam. On the face of it, in faded marker, "Orchard, do not remove." He brought up the historical data on his laptop, cross-referenced the internal Asterian calendar Gideon had provided, and found the entry he had been dreading and expecting simultaneously. Final dynamic test, RX-1 Unit 03, scheduled start 9:15 a.m. Cancellation order issued 9:03 a.m. Authorization. Sierra Calloway, then serving as Vice President of Strategic Development. 12 minutes. 15 years of silence, purchased in 12 minutes. Night 47 was cold. The temperature had dropped into the mid-20s, and the shop's space heater worked hard to maintain something survivable. Holden had been awake for 31 of the previous 36 hours. His hands were steady in the particular way hands get steady when they have run out of room to be nervous. Gideon was there, having driven up that afternoon, moving slowly but moving. Whitney was near the door with a camera. Dorian was on the phone, a secure connection, speaker set low, his voice arriving from Montana as a periodic murmur of confirmation. The atmosphere in the shop was like the air before a surgical procedure, focused, quiet, and carrying the weight of everything that depended on precision. Holden ran each step without rushing. He pressurized the cooling loop to check for leaks before committing any electrical current to the system. He brought auxiliary power online at a fraction of its rated capacity. He walked the control board into maintenance mode, bypassing the corrupted startup defaults. He loaded the cold start sequence from the drive, verified the checksum, confirmed the injection timing. He disconnected the fail-safe relay that would have misread the turbine's early ignition cycle as a fault. He installed the Orchard module into the diagnostic port, and he began the thermal pre-cycle for the turbine, a slow, low-speed rotation to distribute lubricant that had been sitting inert in the housing for 15 years. The first attempt failed within seconds. A temperature warning fired from sensor array 4, and the system shut down before the turbine reached operational speed. The second attempt saw the auxiliary battery voltage drop below threshold. On the third attempt, the entire shop lost power for several seconds. Gideon said they should consider stopping. Holden was already on his back beneath the control bay, running his finger along the wiring harness until he felt it. A lead reversed at a junction block. Not a degraded connection, reversed. Someone, at some point after the project was canceled, had swapped 2 leads in the temperature monitoring circuit so that any cold start attempt would abort before the turbine reached operating condition, leaving no obvious trace of interference. Holden rewired the junction with a short spare lead. He reset the board. He ran the pre-cycle once more. At 2:16 in the morning on night 47, he initiated the full sequence. The first sound was a series of relays clicking in rapid succession. Then a sound from the turbine housing that had no clean analogy, something between a breath and a hum, a low sustained tone with texture to it, the sound of metal parts that had not moved in 15 years beginning to find their geometry again. The instrument panel lit in a ripple of blue-white. The cracked screen at the center of the dash resolved from gray static to the Asterion startup screen to something entirely new, a status readout in small, clean text. Asterion RX-1, Unit 3, final trial mode of variable. The turbine settled into its idle cycle. Temperature readings were correct and stable. The auxiliary battery was holding. The cooling system was circulating. Every system was awake and reporting. Holden watched the data come in and felt something come loose in his chest. A long-held tightness releasing slowly, the way a joint that has been locked too long finally gives. Gideon did not cry exactly. He blinked several times and pressed one hand flat against his knee. Whitney stood motionless at the door, camera running, saying nothing. From the phone speaker, Dorian Blake's voice arrived after a pause of several seconds. It remembers the way home. When the Orchard module completed its connection handshake, a new line appeared on the screen. Archived Acutive Hold Order to Detect. The archive had loaded. In a hotel room in Chicago, a monitoring application on Sierra Calloway's phone registered an activation signal from a legacy system identifier she had not seen in 15 years. She sat up straight in the dark and called Vaughn Mercer. She said 3 words, "It came on." The short video Whitney posted the next morning, less than 10 seconds, showing only the blue glow along the instrument panel and the faint sound of the turbine at idle, reached a large audience by noon and a very large one by evening. Technology publications picked it up. Automotive forums dissected every frame. The question that appeared most frequently in various forms was, if it couldn't run, why does it look like it's running? Asterion responded within 48 hours with a formal statement characterizing the RX-1 as an unvalidated and potentially hazardous legacy prototype. Sierra appeared in a brief media interview and said with careful, genuine-sounding concern, "A machine that lights up is not a machine that runs." That statement decided it for Holden. He confirmed with a local attorney that operating the vehicle on privately owned land with no commercial application of any proprietary software fell within his rights as the physical owner. He had written his own startup bridge using the structural logic Dorian had described verbally. He had every right to demonstrate what he had built on his own land. He announced the test publicly with 72 hours' notice. An open invitation. Journalists, independent engineers, members of the public, and Asterion Motors if they chose to attend. In the 3 days before the test, Holden almost never slept. He reinforced the undercarriage mounting points, replaced the test tires, wired an independent mechanical data logger that would generate records no one could accuse him of having manipulated, and installed an emergency cutoff operable from outside the vehicle. One evening, he stood before the RX-1 and removed the old Asterion logo plate that had cracked and oxidized on the side panel. He cleaned it carefully but didn't replace it and didn't throw it away. He leaned it against the front tire. He told Gideon, "I don't want to erase their name. I want them to look at what they left behind." The night before the test, Sierra Calloway arrived at the shop alone. She walked in and stood near the entrance, hands in the pockets of her coat, looking at the RX-1. She told Holden he didn't understand what he was about to do, not in terms of the machine, but in terms of what its success would mean. Stock value, supplier contracts, manufacturing partnerships, employee pensions. She said he was holding all of that and treating it as if it were only a point of principle. Holden said that she had made the truth into a liability, that she had turned a decision she was afraid to defend into a story she forced everyone around her to live inside for 15 years. Sierra went cold and said, "You think you're turning on a machine. You're burning down a company." Holden replied, "No, I'm turning on a light in a room you locked a long time ago." She left. At the edge of the lot, before getting into her car, she turned and looked through the open shop door at the RX-1 one last time. Her expression carried something she had not let show in public in a very long time. The morning of the test was cold, the kind of cold that makes exhaled breath visible and brings everyone's attention to the present moment. The Marrow Creek Test Circuit, a former agricultural machinery assessment loop behind a family-owned property whose owners had agreed to host, was lined 4 and 5 people deep on both sides. The crowd was larger than anyone had anticipated. Technologists, mechanics, farmers, automotive journalists who had driven through the night, and a contingent of independent engineers who had seen the video and wanted to look at the data themselves. At one end of the road, the Asterion group stood apart. Vaughn Mercer, in a charcoal overcoat, 2 attorneys, a communications director with a tablet in her hand, and Sierra Calloway, slightly separate from the others. An independent engineer named Archer Hayes, sourced by Whitney through a national credentialing organization with no prior connection to either party, had inspected the vehicle the previous afternoon and signed off on the basic safety conditions of the test environment. When Vaughn Mercer approached the start line and requested a halt on public safety grounds, Hayes produced his inspection record. There was no legal basis to stop it. Holden got into the vehicle. The interior was cramped and exposed, wiring visible along every surface, the dashboard a patchwork of original components and hand-wired additions. The screen cracked in the lower right corner but displaying cleanly. He pulled the restraint across his chest and activated the drive sequence. RX-1 rolled forward. The first 20 meters were slow, the kind of slow that makes a crowd hold its breath in a doubtful way. The turbine cycle was barely audible. Then the transmission handoff engaged, the turbine reached its operational band, and the sound changed. Clean, deep, self-consistent. The vehicle accelerated. The first circuit was completed without incident. Thermal readings across both loops stayed 10% below maximum. The second circuit showed the regenerative system actively returning charge to the buffer, not at simulated levels, but at real ones, measurably higher than the design baseline. On the third circuit, Holden brought the speed into the range the original test parameters had called for, held it there through the long straight portion of the loop, and brought it back with a controlled deceleration that fed another measurable charge return into the system. He came to a stop at the start line. The turbine wound down to idle. The vehicle sat still. For a moment the crowd was completely quiet. Then the noise built from several places at once. Not cheering exactly, but a collective release of suspended disbelief. Archer Hayes walked directly to the vehicle before anyone else reached it, looked at the external data logger, and said in a voice audible to the people standing nearest, If these numbers are real, this system is 10 years ahead of anything currently in production. The numbers were real. Then the Orchard module completed its final handshake. The archive transferred to the independent logging devices that Whitney and Gideon had each connected before the run. The central display switched from operational data to a document interface. Whitney connected it to a portable projector near the timing board. The image appeared large enough for most of the crowd to read, Unit 03, Final Simulation Results, Efficiency Indices Exceeding Baseline by 31%. Executive Hold Issued. Rationale documented internally. RX-1 success presents unacceptable conflict with existing PIN technology investment thesis. Authorization to cancel trial. Sierra Callaway. Financial Impact Assessment authorizing permanent suppression of project data. Vaughn Mercer. The document was dated. The signatures were legible. Journalists turned toward the Asterion contingent with cameras. Vaughn Mercer began walking toward the parking area and was surrounded before he had taken 15 steps. Sierra remained where she was. She looked at the projected text for a long time without speaking. Gideon walked slowly to where the crowd was thickest and confirmed, in a shaking but clear voice, that every document in the archive was genuine. Dorian Blake appeared on Whitney's phone screen and confirmed the cold start code and the archive contents, and stated that the project had been terminated not because of technical failure, but because its success was financially inconvenient. Holden stepped out of the RX-1. He was dirty from the engine bay work he'd done at 6 that morning. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't perform anything. He stood next to the vehicle and waited. A journalist asked whether he planned to pursue legal action against Asterion Motors. Holden said, "I didn't bring this thing here to tear anyone down. I brought it here because for 15 years they called the truth a failure. I just needed to give the truth a chance to say something for itself." The RX-1 sat at the center of the road, turbine winding slowly at idle, the old Asterion logo leaning against the front tire where Holden had placed it, catching the morning light. The weeks after the test moved in a way that felt accelerated to everyone who had been involved in the months of quiet work that preceded it. Technology publications carried the story. Automotive industry analysts wrote about what it implied for decision-making culture in large engineering companies. Asterion's stock fell 17% in the first 3 trading days. Vaughn Mercer tendered his resignation before a formal board removal vote could be scheduled. Sierra Callaway was placed on suspension pending a regulatory review. Whitney published a longer account that filled in the financial architecture of Asterion's decision. The degree to which Mercer's personal financial position had depended on the PIN partnership remaining the company's primary strategic direction, and the degree to which the suppression of the RX-1 had protected not the company's future but one man's investment thesis at the company's expense. The documentation came from the archive, from Dorian's files, and from corporate records that became accessible during the review. 6 weeks after the test, Sierra Callaway asked to meet Holden privately. She came alone to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon. She told him that in the year the hold order was issued, she had been 31 years old and had believed, sincerely, that protecting the company's trajectory was the same as protecting the people who worked there. She said she had told herself that the suppression of the RX-1 was a necessary sacrifice, and that she had told herself this so many times and with such consistency that it had almost become something that resembled truth. Holden listened. He said that she had not only buried a machine, she had told the people who built it, Gideon, Dorian, the entire team, that what they had made was not worth protecting. She had told them they had failed, and then she had spent 15 years building a company on the story of that failure. Sierra sat with that. She said, "I know." Multiple acquisition offers followed. Holden engaged with each inquiry on the same terms. Before any agreement was reached, 3 conditions had to be met. Gideon Hart and Dorian Blake were to be formally credited as founding engineers of the RX-1 program in any public documentation of the technology. All test data from the unit had to be submitted to an independent audit body before any commercial licensing was pursued. Any entity that commercialized the RX-1 technology had to establish a funded support program for the technicians and engineers who had lost work when the project was canceled in 2009. These conditions were not negotiable. They were honored. The following spring, the shop in Marrow Creek still bore the same painted sign on the same faded metal frame. Inside, it still smelled of oil and work. But behind the main bay, through a door that hadn't existed a year earlier, there was a new structure, a clean, well-lit testing annex built from private grant funding, with the kind of equipment that made Gideon Hart nod slowly and smile when he first walked through it. The annex bore no name. Holden had declined to put one on it. Gideon drove up from Dayton twice a month and sat at the bench and talked through problems, and the engineers who came to work alongside Holden listened to him the way people listen to someone who has carried accurate knowledge across a long silence. Dorian Blake returned to active engineering work for the first time in 15 years, affiliated with an independent research group working on propulsion efficiency. Whitney Boone published a series that ran over 8 months and won national recognition. In every interview she gave about it, she redirected the premise. The story was not about what she had uncovered, she said. It was about what the machine had been waiting to say. At the regional engineering conference that fall, the RX-1 was displayed not behind a velvet rope and not on a polished platform, but exactly as it had arrived. Road-worn, hand-repaired, the old Asterion logo leaning against the front tire as Holden had positioned it at the test. Sierra Calloway attended as a private citizen, wearing no badge that identified her former title. She stood in the crowd during the technical presentation and watched the RX-1's data move across the screen at the front of the room. Afterward, in the hallway, she and Holden encountered each other. He nodded. She nodded. They did not perform a reconciliation for anyone watching. But they stood in the same space without animosity, and for the people who had followed the story from the beginning, that was its own kind of resolution. Maddie was in the audience that day, sitting in the third row with a notebook open in her lap. A graduate student sitting nearby asked if she was related to the Barrett from the RX-1 case. Maddie said yes. The student said that was remarkable and asked what it had been like to watch. Maddie thought about it and said, "He didn't fix it to prove anyone wrong. He fixed it because he didn't know how to walk away from something that still had something to say." That evening, Holden drove the RX-1 out to the test road one last time. Not for a demonstration, not for a record. The sun was going down behind the tree line to the west, throwing long orange light across the flat ground, and the turbine ran quietly at the speed of a relaxed conversation. Gideon stood by the edge of the road and watched. Whitney had her camera, but kept it low. Dorian listened to the engine sound from Montana through a phone held close to the speaker. Holden completed the circuit and came to a stop where he had started. He sat with the engine at idle. On the dash, the status line read what he had entered into the system the night before the conference, in the space where the original designation had been. RX-1 stat, alive. He turned the engine off. The turbine wound down in its unhurried way, the cooling metal making its small sounds in the dark. Holden sat still for a moment. He thought about the $900, the 47 nights, the 12 minutes that had stolen 15 years from people who deserved better. Then he exhaled, long and slow, the breath of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long it had become part of his posture. Some machines are not built to be sold. Some machines only need to run once, to let the world know who was lying when they called them a failure.
Oh, I'm out of health. Oh my god, he's like literally one hit. He's only one hit away. Easy. Oh! Oh! Give it to me. What's up, handsome? I played this a while ago. I never beat the game, but I played it. Give me that shit. Don't fuck with me. It's like the first boss in the game. All right. We messed that bitch up. By yogis. Aha. I love it. Ring the bell. Let him know. There's a new king in town, baby. The song already was turned, but here's the bell. Ding.
You just had to make some noise, did you? Now everyone knows you're here. When a chime so grand echoes in the forest, Yao Guais will surely be alive.
Ginkgo! Ginkgo, thank you for the follow. How you doing, Ginkgo?